Miriam Tawil coming to you from Jerusalem. This day is dedicated to Rabbi Dr. Ezra Labaton, Alav Shalom, my former Rav, and anything that I'm able to teach today, my learning is in his merit. Our topic today is faith in times of distress. It's difficult to have faith when things are not going so well, when we're sitting here and commemorating a day like Tish'a BeAb, which is a very, very hard day, where we commemorate the destruction of the two temples while we're sitting in the midst of a pandemic, not to mention all of our personal difficulties that we may be encountering. So this idea of having faith or emunah in times of distress, I felt was very relevant to where we are today. And I wanted to see if we could look at a couple of ideas in the short time that we have, some of it based on the Rav and Rav Soloveitchik and others, the Rav being Rabbi Labaton's Rav as well. And I wanted to start with the pasuk from Tehillim in Perek Sadidalit, where it says, Tov lehodot Hashem ulezamer l'shimcha alyon. Tov lehodot Hashem, it's good to praise Hashem. Tov lehodot ulezamer l'hagid baboker chazdecha ve'emunatcha alelot. To sing your praises in the daytime, but emunatcha, your faith, balelot. This idea of emunatcha balelot, that faith is going to come or be very necessary during the dark times, during the periods of darkness. Emunatcha balelot. So the question that we want to ask ourselves today is, well, what does it mean to have faith, and especially in times of distress? Whether we're talking on a national level, as we are today, or on an individual level. When things are going well, it's very easy to move along and be very happy with how things are. But when things don't go exactly as we would like, that's when it starts to get tricky. So this idea of emunatcha balelot, having faith in times of distress, having faith when it's very difficult to do so. So we're going to look a little bit at, before we discuss what faith actually is, we're going to talk about what faith is not. And for that, we're going to look at Harambam, Maimonides in the Moreh Nevuchim, where he says that one should know that faith is not a verbal utterance, but rather a matter that is represented in the soul. That one should believe that it is in fact as it has been represented. Rambam is very clear in saying that to be a believing person, to have faith in God, is not enough to say that I do. It shouldn't be just something that I say sort of haphazardly, but it has to be something that reflects, my words have to reflect what I really feel inside, what's going on for me inside. So it's this idea of having, Harambam says, an internal belief that is true, and we don't just say it. We don't just say we believe in God or we believe in Torah mitzvot. We believe only if it's something that we have internalized and that we actually really think. So it should represent something for us internally. Not just be something that we just say kind of randomly. We also know that there's a difference between faith and logic. We're talking about what faith is now. Well, we also know that faith is not something that you can put, under a microscope and examine. It's not something that is subject to the laws of nature. Human beings are very difficult in this respect. So on the one side, we're part of creation and we're part of the natural world. And we do function according to logic, and we have that side to us. But on the other hand, the man of faith, as the Rabbi describes it, is a man of the covenant, man meaning the human being. This idea of religion being something, or religious concepts not being able to be rationalized. When we talk about faith, we're going above and beyond the natural world, and we're talking about things that belong in the realm of I wouldn't even say emotion, but certainly above and beyond the intellect. It's something in a different realm. And what happens to us when we try to reconcile these two sides, it's a bit difficult sometimes to reconcile our logical side with our faithful side. And sometimes there's an inner conflict that results from these two, as the Rav describes it. But we're going to leave that for now because we don't have a ton of time, so I'm going to keep moving. But when we first look at the first time in the Torah that we are confronted with this idea of having faith, we actually find it in Avraham Avinu, who is the exemplar of having faith in God, as the pasuk says in Bereshit, "V'he'emin b'Hashem v'yachashveha lo tzedakah." That Abraham is the first to believe. He believes in God, and this is for him a merit. But it's interesting to note that the emunah that Abraham has comes out of suffering. I want to return to this idea a little bit later. We all know that Abraham didn't have an easy life, and he was tried many different times with many different nisyonot, many different tests, whether it was having to leave his homeland, whether it was being barren, his wife being barren, not having children, whether it was the Akedah, having to send away Hagar. There was so many issues that Abraham faced, and yet he is the paradigm of emunah in the sense that he had tremendous endurance and he had tremendous acceptance of the sorrow that he found in his life, that confronted him in his life. So interesting to note that the first time we're looking at this idea of faith, of emunah, we're associated with Abraham. Now that's on an individual level. What about on a national level? If we look at Bnei Israel, and the first time that we see Bnei Israel as a nation, this is happening in Mitzrayim, right? And this is also being born out of tremendous suffering. So this idea, as we said so far, that according to Rambam, faith is not something that we just say, but it has to represent this internal idea that we have inside and we know to be true. Faith is also something that is very different from logic in that it doesn't conform to the natural laws of life. And yet, at the same time, when we look in the Torah to find an example, well, who is a believer? Who is somebody who represents faith? So it's Abraham on an individual level, given all the difficulties that he endured in his life, and yet he is considered the paradigm, and also Bnei Israel as a nation who were born out of this sense of suffering. So when we look at all of this and we try to put it together, we see that faith is not something that comes easy. It's something that we have to work for, something that has to be striven for, something that we really have to try and acquire. We also find in the Torah, the first time that this word emunah is used has to do with Moshe Rabbeinu. When Bnei Israel are fighting Amalek, recall that the hands of Moshe needed to be raised. When Moshe's hands were raised up, of course in prayer, then vayu yadav emunah. Moshe's hands were considered emunah. And the term emunah there, again, the first time that word is actually used in the Torah, when it appears there, it actually is understood as stability. This idea of emunah, having faith, and being stable. Moshe's hands actually remained in place until the darkness, until the end of the fighting. So this idea of emunah being a sense of stability, that faith is something that we maintain in the most difficult situations, right? Even in a time of tremendous national suffering, when they were fighting Amalek. Amalek, of course, is the epitome of evil. And Moshe's hands are emunah. So this idea of faith being something that we have to maintain within ourselves, within our hearts, but at the same time, interestingly enough, it's actually a Hasidic idea. It has to pervade all of our beings, right? It's not enough to think about belief, and it's not enough to even feel it in our hearts, but it has to be something, according to Rav Nachman, that pervades all of our bodies, so that even Moshe's hands represented faith. So I think if we take this down to a very practical level, it means that it's not enough to give lip service to this, but we need to actually live by this. If we believe that there's God and that God is watching over us and there is a plan to life, then this has to influence our actions. It's not enough just to think it internally, but it has to be something that we live by. So according to this, our faith has to permeate and animate our lives as a whole. What we believe internally must be reflected externally. And this is the meaning of what it means to say, I live a life of faith. Sometimes even we might have to fight with great difficulty to get to that point. Again, it's not easy. We mentioned there are times in life when it's very difficult to have faith, and we have to really fight to get to that point of being able to really mean what we say. And on a national level, when Bnei Israel were fighting Amalek, in this instance, They were fighting evil, right? Amalek is representing evil. And they had belief, they had faith that they would overcome it. We're going to have to look at it a little later in terms of how does that translate to us on an individual level, which I hope we'll come back to soon. So again, going back to this idea that we started with from the Pasuk in Tehillim, the idea of faith being something that becomes exceptionally difficult, but most needed, balelot, be'emunatcha balelot. When things are foggy, when things are unclear, when reality is unclear, when everything seems upside down, right? This is when faith is about believing that someday the external reality that I see around me, whether it's destruction, whether it's a pandemic, or whether it's on a personal level, somebody's going through a difficult time, can I believe that at that difficult hour, the external reality will one day be different and look more like what I believe inside? And having faith is a very critical piece of what it means to be part of the Jewish people. We're gonna, I hope, come back to that if we have time. I'm just trying to get through everything. Okay, so now I'd like to turn to Chavakuk HaNavi. Chavakuk is a Navi that we don't really hear so much about because he's wedged into this book called Tre'asar in the Nevi'im. But Chavakuk is very important because he, by his life, represents what it means to have faith. He's credited with the statement of Tzaddik be'emunato yichya. This statement, which means that a righteous person lives by his faith. But before we get to that, we want to understand who is Chavakuk. Why am I bringing him up? So we know that Chavakuk is a Navi from Bayit Rishon, from the first temple times. He was dealing with the difficulty of Aliyat Babel, when Babel was coming to Eretz to destroy the Beit HaMikdash. He's dealing with the question of tzaddik veralo primarily in his nevuot. Chavakuk is describing the difficulty of why bad things happen to good people. There's so much violence and sin going on around him. The Torah is not being kept. The tzaddik is calling out and is not being answered. This is what's going on during Chavakuk's time. If we had time, I would read it inside. And he's talking about the injustice that he sees around him. And here's this Navi, and he is railing, Chavakuk is railing against the injustice that he sees. He says, the mishpat me'ukal, the idea of justice being perverted, this is not okay, and he's railing against it. And what is God's response to Chavakuk in this small Navi that we have? He says that there is an end vision, that what you see today is not what it's always going to be like. It might take time. I'm paraphrasing the Hebrew. It's going to take time, but we have to wait for it. We have to wait for it because it will come. And this famous line of Tzaddik be'emunato yichya, that a person who is righteous will live by his faith. And when is faith born out? Again, as we said before, in the most difficult hour. Emunatcha balelot. It's very easy for someone to believe in God and to believe that all will be good when things are going well. But when things are not, that's when we're really called upon to go inside deeply. This is on an individual level and on a national level, to go inside and say, well, what are we made of? And what do we really believe? And can we withstand the difficulties that we're facing? Again, whether as an individual or as a nation. So these are just some of the thoughts about Chavakuk, that he is the one that represents this, because he says that despite what's going on around him, he understands that there will be a better time. Another reason why I bring up Chavakuk is because there are those that say, it's actually said in the Zohar, that Chavakuk is son of the Isha Hashunamit. We're going back to our Navi for a minute. In Melachim Bet, we all recall the story of the Navi Elisha, who goes to this Shunamit woman who is barren and tells her, you will bear a son. And after a bit of time, the son is born, but then he dies. And the Shunamit woman goes and seeks out Elisha the Navi. Her son is dead on her lap. She doesn't take that as the reality. She's a believing woman. She has faith. She runs to Elisha Navi. By the way, this is all in Melachim Bet, Perek Daled, anybody who wants to review it afterward. And she goes and she seeks out the Navi Elisha, and the story is that Elisha comes to the boy and he revives him, and he literally revives him from his death. So this idea of Habakkuk being a symbol of faith, just by his very existence and by the power of his faith, and his story is actually encapsulated. Those of you who are studying the Amidah with me, in the second bracha of the Amidah, we have the bracha of Mechaya Metim, resurrection of the dead, and it says there, "V'ne'eman ata lachayot metim," that God is going to bring a time when there will be this resurrection of the dead. Again, going contrary to anything we could possibly imagine is true, based on our natural laws. And this idea of Habakkuk being encapsulated in this second bracha is right there, because he's the example of a person who was revived and brought back from the dead. Why do I bring this example? Because Habakkuk, again, is the Navi that sees reality, sees the difficult reality that he's facing, and yet he's encouraging others to still believe, despite what you're seeing, despite the external reality. There will be a better day. It won't be like this forever. So until now, we've been speaking mostly about, we've been talking about faith on an individual level, in the sense that these individual people had faith, whether it was Habakkuk, Abraham. Now we're going to talk a little bit about what's going on for us as a nation. We're here today commemorating Tish'a BeAb, the greatest destruction of both the first and second temples. And we're saddened by the fact that we don't have our temples. But if you look at Echa, which we read last night, Echa, the Megillah that we read, the difficulty is not just the physical destruction, but it's also the spiritual separation that we feel from God. And this often happens when we're in a time of distress. As we said over and over again, it's hard to believe when things are going wrong. The pasuk starts in Echa, Perek Bek, Echa ya'iv be'apo Hashem et bat Zion, hishlich mishamayim aretz, tiferet Yisrael, v'lo zachar hadom ragla b'yom apo. This description of God sort of throwing Bnei Israel out. We were completely separated. We were distant from God, so much so that even our prayers were blocked. If you look further in Megillat Echa, in Perek Gimel, the pasuk says, "Sakota be'anan lach me'avor tefillah." You basically, God, you put up like a cloud, like a separation, a barrier between us, so that not only were we thrown out, but we were pushed out on a spiritual level. Gam ki azak, the pasuk continues later on, Gam ki azak v'ashaveh satam tefilati. God, you blocked our prayers. Is there any more difficult feeling than feeling like I can't even pray, like I can't even connect with God? It's one thing to feel physically the destruction, but on another level, spiritually, this idea that we were distant from God, distant and blocked. So again, comes in this idea of emunatcha balelot. Do we believe, even in the most difficult hours, in this time of darkness, when our faith is really put to the test? Again, whether it's the Chorban, the destruction, whether it's the pandemic, we're seeing such suffering and it's very hard, whether we're feeling a personal loss or disappointment of some kind. It's times like these that we have to remember, not just the destruction, but we have to also remember what comes after it, which is, continuing in Megillat Echa, Chadashim labekarim rabba emunatacha. And this is a very positive pasuk. It's something that really gives us a sense of hope. What does it mean? Chadashim labekarim rabba emunatacha. It means that every morning is new, every day is new. And according to Rashi, before I get to Rashi, just as the natural law is fixed in the world, I don't think anybody here doubts that the sun is going to rise every day. This is a natural law that's fixed in creation. So too, should we hopefully believe, just as a natural law, that redemption will come. It's not something that we doubt. It's something that is coming our way, and we'll talk more about why that is. But before that, Rashi explains, what does it mean to say Rabba emunatacha? Rabba emunatacha means that every day God's chesed is renewed. Your promise is great, God. You promised us that it won't be like this forever. And it's an act of faith on our part to believe that, to believe what God promised us. And again, anybody who studies Navi will see tons and tons of prakim where redemption is promised. So do I believe in God, in his promise? Do I believe that he will fulfill his promises? This is what it means, emunatcha balelot. If we can actually believe during the times when it's most difficult that chadashim labekarim, there's another morning coming. Just like there's another morning coming, rabba emunatecha, the belief that God will fulfill his promises has to be as strong as the natural law around me. And why should it be different? Continued pasuk, ki lo yanuach, ki lo yiznach leolam, amonai. God will not neglect us forever. We are now going through a very difficult time, the Navi says, but don't think it's going to last. It's not. There will be times when it will be better, and we have to hope and pray to get to those times. I'm afraid I'm getting kicked off, so I'm going to just move a little bit further. So what we said so far, just to back up to go forward, the idea of Chabakuk HaNavi being a symbol of having faith and believing in the promises told to him despite the reality, despite the external reality. The idea of us as a nation on Tish'a BeAb having national faith in our time of darkness and believing in this, what I like to call the law of redemption, the idea that Echa promises us, even in the midst of all the terrible tragedy that we're suffering, that we're going to get to a better time. I'm going to do one more idea with you before we start to close, and this is from the Rav Soloveitchik, in honor of my rabbi. He talks about something very interesting. Two ideas. I hope we'll get to them. One is called a depth crisis, and the other is called the dialectical experience of life. What is the depth crisis, and why do I bring this out? This is a different form of suffering in life that some people choose to experience, according to the Rav. He actually says it's ideal if everyone gets to this point where they have what he calls a depth crisis. So what is it? As opposed to a surface crisis, which is something, God forbid, a disease or something external to us, that's the surface crisis. What is a depth crisis? The Rav talks about this feeling which underlies our whole existence. It's a form of private, internal suffering, which the mature person who really thinks about it chooses to confront. And it comes from this realization that we as human beings are finite. We as human beings are not complete. We're not perfect. We realize that so much of what comes with good comes with its opposite in life. And this is a very difficult thing. So the Rav tries to explain, going forward, in my 2 minutes, I just got my warning, that this idea of having this depth crisis is about realizing that we are finite, we are incomplete, we are imperfect beings, and yet what this does, hopefully for us, is give us a sense of that we are utterly dependent on God and that we are accepting of our limitations as human beings. So having this as a backdrop on an individual level, we come to the last point, which is this dialectical experience of life, where we feel two opposite emotions at the same time. And with this, I'm going to conclude, Rabbi Haber. The idea that we have two opposite emotions the Rav describes, best exemplified by David HaMelech in Tehillim. Anybody who picks up Tehillim sees very easily that David HaMelech sees himself as a king and a pauper at the same time. He's full of victory and he's full of defeat. He's full of majesty and humility. And so look at that. He's a human being. Life is about dichotomies. It's about contradictions. It's about triumph and loss. And so that is true about us too. So as opposed to thinking that the woman or the man of faith is somebody who always believes and never has any doubts and never has any questions, the answer is the opposite. We're human beings and we are going to fluctuate between these highs and these lows. And that is part of what it means to be a person of faith. But the question that we have to ask ourselves, and with this I'm really ending, is, do we believe that after the night comes the dawn? Do we believe that we have the power to affect the change that we want to see? Do we believe that no matter how bleak things look, that one day it'll look better? And if we look again at the end of Echa, Nachpasad, Rachenu v'Nachkora, v'Nashuba ad Hashem, Hashivenu Hashem Elecha v'Nashuba Chadesh Yameinu Kekedem. The key lies with us. We want to be able to change and grow and be the best that we can possibly be. And we ask God to return us as we are returning to Him. And this is our faith in God. This is what it means to have faith during times of distress, because God promised it to us, and both on a national and an individual level. Having faith in times of distress means believing very deeply in the possibility of being redeemed from our current constraints. Tizku b'nechmat Zion. Thank you.